listed as a widow though her husband was living. A Lakota chief made the word true and wed her. The paper said widow. I saw it tacked to the land office door in Harker's Creek the spring they were running new homestead claims, the ink still damp from the morning cold. A list of names and their standing, widows eligible for the extended acre allotment the territory was offering to women without husbands. Her name was on it. Clara Birch, widow, claimant, Section 9. I knew who she was. Most people in that part of the territory knew who she was, not because she made herself known, but because she had come with Reuben Birch 4 years back, and then Reuben Birch had left and she had stayed, which was the kind of thing people noticed and then talked about and then eventually stopped talking about, because talking about a thing doesn't feed a horse. I did not know her well. I had traded at Falk's Post where she sometimes brought eggs, and 2 or 3 times I had seen her on the road between her claim and the creek, driving a small wagon with a gray mule pulling it who always looked annoyed. I knew her face the way you know a face when you have seen it in the same light a few times. She nodded. I nodded. That was the sum of it. But I stood there reading that paper and I felt something I could not have named exactly. Not anger. Not the thing I sometimes felt when the territory did something careless or small. Something more like, the word she was given did not belong to her, and she had taken it anyway because it was the only word that let her hold onto what she had built, and that seemed to me a kind of hardness that most people don't have to carry. Being called the widow of a man still living somewhere. Wearing a word that was a lie and a truth at the same time. I took my goods and rode back to our camp. I should say who I am, because it matters for what comes later. My name in the language of my people is something that does not translate well. The men at Harker's Creek called me 2 lodges, which was near enough, and after a while I did not correct it. I was chief of a small band, not large, not powerful in the way that word gets used, but steady. We had been steady for a long time. My father had been steady before me and his father before him, and we had learned to hold what we held without making it a fight every season. By the spring I am talking about I was 51 years old. I had been married. My wife, Roan Skye, had died of a fever 8 winters before, and I had raised our son, who was by then 17 and already better with horses than I had ever been. I was not a man who sat around feeling sorry for himself. I had work. I had my people. I had the particular kind of quiet that comes when you stop expecting the world to hand you anything. I had also, by then, learned to live without being seen. Not invisible, but unaccounted for. There were men in Harker's Creek who shook my hand and meant it. There were also men who looked through me the way you look through a dirty window, seeing only what they expected to be on the other side. I had stopped bothering with the ones who looked through me. You can spend your whole life trying to make yourself visible to people whose eyes are set wrong, and it will not change their eyes. It will only cost you time. So I was a man with his standing among his own people, which was real and solid as the ground, and a kind of shadow among many of the settlers, which I had made my peace with. That was how it was. The trouble started in June. A man named Cord Mackey had been making a claim on Clara Birch's Section 9 for about a month by then. Not a legal claim, he had no paper on it, but he had 2 brothers and a hired hand, and they had the habit of parking a wagon on the road at the edge of her land and just sitting there. Not doing anything you could point to. Just sitting. The way a man can make a threat with his posture. I heard about it at Falk's. The storekeeper, Falk himself, a thin Lutheran man who worried about everyone, told me Cord Mackey had been saying around town that the widow Birch was going to sell him that Section 9, whether she wanted to or not, because she could not hold it alone and she was going to run out of season before she ran out of stubbornness. I bought my tobacco and rode out to Section 9. I don't know exactly why. I had turned over the question on the ride out and I had not arrived at a satisfying answer. She had not asked me for anything. We had nodded at each other on a road 3 times. She was not my responsibility. But I knew what Cord Mackey was. Because I had seen what Cord Mackey was, a man who mistakes patience for weakness in anyone who doesn't come out swinging, and who pushes until something pushes back. I also knew, though I might not have said it this plainly at the time, that she had been left with a word that was wrong, widow, and she was holding on anyway, and something in that sat in me like a coal. When I came up the track to her place, she was splitting wood behind the cabin. She did not stop when she heard my horse. She finished the split she was on, set the halves aside, and then straightened and looked at me. She said, "2 lodges." I said, "I heard about Mackie." She said, "People talk." I said, "He is going to push." She looked at me for a moment and then looked at the axe in her hand and then looked back at me. She said, "I know it." That was the whole of it. I did not offer anything more, and she did not ask for anything more. I nodded and turned my horse. When I got back to the road cord, Mackie's wagon was 50 yards up, one of his brothers sitting on the bench looking at me with a face like curdled milk. I rode past him slowly. I did not look at him. I looked at the road ahead, the way you look at what matters and let what doesn't matter sit in your peripheral vision where it belongs. The weeks that followed were not dramatic in the way that gets told. There was no gunfight. I want to be clear about that, because when men tell stories about that kind of summer, they often dress it up with things that didn't happen. What happened was I started riding that road more. Not every day, but regular enough that the Mackie wagon saw me pass, sometimes twice in a day, sometimes with 2 or 3 of my men. We never stopped. We never spoke to them. We moved the way a river moves, not threatening, just there, just going where we go, not bothered by the rocks. A river doesn't threaten rocks, but rocks move for rivers eventually. Cord Mackie came to find me at Falk's one morning toward the end of June. He was a big man, reddish, the kind who sweats even in shade. He stood close and said he didn't appreciate strangers riding his territory. I said, "I didn't know you owned the road." He said I knew what he meant. I said, "I know what you mean. I also know what you are doing to that woman's land, and I know what the land agent in Harker's Creek thinks of men who make informal claims by sitting on the road like a pile of bad weather." He said some things after that. I don't need to repeat them. The shape of what he said was the usual shape. The word for my people, he thought, was an insult, which I had heard enough times that it landed like rain on oilskin. I let it go and let it go and let it go. Then he said something about Clara Birch that I will not repeat either, because it was the kind of thing a small man says about a woman when he wants to make her small too. I said, "You're going to want to stop." He said, "Or what?" I said, "Or you will find that I have a great deal more patience than you have, and more time, and more men who know how to wait. And at the end of your patience and your time, the land agent will still have her name on Section 9, and you will have a wagon and a bad season." I bought my tobacco, I left. 2 days later, Cord Mackie's wagon was gone from the road. The brothers lasted another week. Then they were gone too. Clara Birch came to our camp in July. She brought bread. She had made it herself, and it was good bread, heavy and dark, the kind that has time baked into it. She brought it wrapped in cloth, and she handed it to me without a speech about it. She said, "This is for the men." I said, "Sit down." She sat. We drank coffee. My son, Kia, brought it and stood there looking at her the way 17-year-olds look at things they're trying to figure out. She thanked him and he went back to work because I gave him a look that said to. She said, "Mackie won't hold. His kind doesn't when they meet something that doesn't move." I said, "No." She said, "I want you to know I don't take for granted what you did." I said, "I didn't do it for you to be grateful." She looked at me then, not startled, just level. She had gray eyes with lines at the corners from squinting into the sun every day for years, and she looked at me the way you look at something you are making up your mind about honestly. She said, "Then why?" I thought about it. I said, "Because the word they put on you was wrong and you wore it anyway and held what you built, and I don't have a lot of patience for men who push on that kind of holding. She was quiet a moment. She said the word widow. I said yes. She said Reuben isn't dead. I said I know. She said he's in Nevada or Colorado or somewhere, doesn't matter. I said no, it doesn't. We drank the coffee. The camp was quiet around us, the horses shifting, my men going about their work. After a while she stood and said she had to get back to her mule, who was not happy standing in a strange place. I said her mule always looked unhappy, and she said that was fair. It was his nature. She rode back out, and I sat there a while after. She came back in August. Not with bread this time, just herself. She had a question about the water rights on the north side of her claim, which touched a creek that my people had used since before any settler had drawn a line on anything. It was a real question, and I gave her a real answer, and then we talked for 2 hours about other things. The dry summer, the price of beef at Harker's Creek, a coyote that had been getting into her chickens with a patience she described as almost admirable. I liked talking to her. That is not a complicated thing to say. She was plain-spoken and sharp, and she did not perform anything for me, not gratitude, not friendliness, not any of the performances women sometimes give when they are around a man they are uncertain of. She was just herself, sitting in the camp with her hat in her hands, her hair loose from whatever she'd put it up with in the morning, talking about a coyote like it was a peer. When she left that day, she turned at the edge of the camp and said, "You don't talk much." I said, "I talk when there's something to say." She said that's a good way to be, and she rode out. I watched her go. I am not going to dress up what I was feeling. I knew what it was. I had not felt it in 8 years, and I recognized it the way you recognize a smell from your boyhood, not gradually, but all at once. I sat with it for a while, then I went back to work. September came dry, and the grass went brown early. Clara Birch's mule died. It happened fast, something internal, the kind of thing that can't be predicted or prevented. Kia heard it in Harker's Creek and told me. I rode to Section 9 that afternoon. She was out behind the cabin where she'd buried the mule in the corner of the south field, because the south field was soft enough to dig, and she'd managed it herself. She was sitting on the low fence looking at the turned earth. She heard my horse and didn't turn around. I came off the horse and stood beside the fence. She said, 8 years I had that mule. I said, I know. She said, he was disagreeable and he bit my sleeve once, and he would not be hurried for anything in the world. I said, I know. She said, I'm going to miss him. I said, yes. We stood there a while. The evening light came across the field in that particular September way, low and copper, making even the turned earth look like something. After a while, her shoulder touched mine and stayed there. She did not say anything. I did not say anything. The horses shifted and the light moved, and we just stood there, the two of us, at the edge of what she'd built and lost and kept building anyway. After a long while she said, I can't run this claim without an animal. I said, I know. She said, I can't buy one, not until spring. I said, I have a horse. She turned and looked at me. I said, not a gift, a loan for the season. She's not fast, but she pulls. Clara Birch looked at me for a long moment, not to figure out the offer. She had already figured out the offer. She was looking at me, at whatever she was adding up in her mind, and I stood there and let her look, because I had nothing to hide and no performance to make. She said, why are you good to me? I said, I think you know. She said, I think I do. She looked back at the turned earth. She said, my husband is still living. I said, I know it. She said, that's a complication. I said, or it isn't. She looked at me again. I said, there are ways to end a marriage when a man has abandoned a woman and not come back in 4 years. A lawyer in Cheyenne could do it. It costs money and it costs time, and it would be done before the spring. She was quiet. I said, I'm not asking for anything. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying the word on that paper at the land office said widow. If that is going to be true in name instead of just in fact, that is something I could be part of if you wanted. In time. Not now. Just, I wanted to say that plainly so you knew what I meant. She stood there a while. The light had gone fully copper and then started going pink. She said, "You are the most careful man I have ever met." I said, "I have been wrong before by being careless." She said, "What do you want? Just tell me plain." I said, "I want to be useful to you, and I want to earn whatever regard you have for me, and I want to see where that goes. That is what I want." She looked at me for a long moment with those gray eyes that didn't cut or challenge, just looked, just weighed. She said, "Bring the horse tomorrow." The winter was hard in the specific way that particular winter was hard, early freeze, ice on the creek, one storm in November that kept everyone inside for 4 days. I brought firewood twice. She came to camp once with a pot of something that was not quite stew and not quite soup and was very good anyway. We did not rush anything. That is not in my nature, and I came to understand it was not in hers either. Rushing is for people who are afraid the thing will disappear if they don't grab it. We were past the age of grabbing at things. What we had, we let sit in the air between us and let it take its own shape. Kia watched all of this with the particular attention of a 17-year-old who thinks he is not watching. He asked me once what I intended. I told him what I had told Clara. I intended to see where it went. He thought about that and then said he liked her. He said she did not talk to him like a child. I said, "Good, she isn't the kind to." He said, "Are you going to marry her?" I said, "That's her decision more than mine." He said, "But you want to." I said, "Yes." He said, "Good," and went back to work, which was exactly the right amount of conversation for both of us. The lawyer in Cheyenne was a man named Pollard who had done this work before and was businesslike about it. Clara rode down with Falk's wife for company in late November, and by December she had a document that said the marriage to Reuben Birch was dissolved on grounds of abandonment. The word widow on the land office paper had always been wrong, and now there was a paper that made the real situation real. She brought the document to camp and showed it to me. She held it with both hands and looked at it. She said, "It's strange. I don't feel anything different." I said, "The ground doesn't move when you put a stake in it. It was already there." She looked at me then, and something in her face shifted, not all at once, not dramatically, just eased. Like something she'd been carrying, she sat down, not because someone told her to, but because she had somewhere to set it. She folded the document and put it in her coat pocket. She said, "I have something I want to say to you." I said, "All right." She said, "You rode out to Section 9 in June when you had no reason to. You sat on the road without making a noise about it, and Cord Mackey and his brothers left. You loaned me a horse without a word about owing. You brought firewood in the dark and didn't wait to be thanked. You told me exactly what you wanted in plain language, and then you waited without pressing it." She looked at me. She said, "No man has ever looked at me and seen something worth being careful with. I want you to know that I have seen what you are, not what you were before I knew you, not what other people say about you, what you are. And what you are is a man I would be lucky to stand beside." I did not say anything for a while. There are things you can receive if you are still enough. She had said a plain thing, and it landed in me the way plain, true things land, hard and clean, and without any echo. I said, "Then stand beside me." She said, "I intend to." We were married in March, at the edge of spring. Not at a church in Harker's Creek. She had no interest in that, and neither did I. We did it twice. Once in the way of my people, with my band gathered, and the old form spoken, and Kia standing next to me with a face like a man trying not to let on that he was moved. And once before a justice of the peace in Harker's Creek, because she had land and rights, and it was useful to have both kinds of paper. Falk came, Falk's wife came, a few others. Cord Mackey did not come, obviously, but the word moved through the territory the way words do, and I know it reached him, and I know what it meant to a man like that to hear it. That thought did not give me any particular satisfaction. Some things are just facts. After the justice of the peace was done, we walked out into the March light, which was thin and cold still, but beginning to have some warmth in it if you stood in the right place. Clara put her hand through my arm the way she had started doing in the fall, not clinging, just present, her hand resting in the crook of my elbow, her shoulder near mine. We stood there on the steps while Falk and the others talked. She looked up at me once. She didn't say anything. She just looked the way she looked at things she had decided about, level and clear and with nothing held back. I looked back at her. That was enough. I am talking about this now because my son asked me to. He is 34 years old and he has children of his own, and he asked me once to tell him the story of how I came to be with Clara, not because he didn't know the facts of it, but because he said he wanted to hear how I told it. I said, I've told it. He said, tell it again. So I have told it again. This is the telling. What I want him to understand, what I want to land in this, because there is one thing I want to land, is that for a long time I was a man nobody in that territory looked at and saw what was there. My own people saw me. But in that larger world out there, the settler world, the world of papers and land offices and lawyers and whiskey and all the machinery of what they were building, I was unaccounted for. A shape they looked through. Clara Birch looked at me. Not out of gratitude. Not because I had done her a favor she needed to repay, not because there was no other option. She looked at me in June when I told her why I had ridden out there, and she looked at me in September by the mule's grave, and she looked at me in December when she said the things she said, and in all of those lookings she was seeing the same thing, what was actually there. An honest man, a steady man, a man who said what he meant and waited and did not push. She said it made her lucky. I think she has it backward. But I have learned that some arguments you do not win. The gray horse we loaned her that first winter is still on the claim. She is very old now and does not work. She eats and stands in the sun in the south corner of the field near where the mule is buried, which I find appropriate. We have good horses now, younger and faster, and the gray one is retired, and Clara brings her something from the kitchen most mornings on her way to the rest of the day's work. I watch her do that sometimes from the fence. Her hair is mostly silver now, and she moves like a woman who knows her ground, easy and unhurried, like she has always been here and always will be. She stops at the fence on her way back and looks at me standing there watching her, and she says, "You have work." I say, "I know." She says, "Then go do it." I say, "In a minute." She shakes her head and walks past me toward the cabin, and I stand there another minute watching her go, because I want to, and because some things you do not rush. The paper at the land office said widow. She was wearing a word that didn't belong to her, and she wore it straight and held onto Section 9, and did not ask anyone for anything. That is the kind of thing that does not bend. I know that kind of thing when I see it. I recognized it in June, and I recognized it every time after. I made the word true. I would do it again.